I've spent months digging through archives, declassified documents, and war crime trial transcripts, trying to answer one question: was Die Glocke real, or are we chasing ghosts in the mountains of Lower Silesia? Before we dive into this rabbit hole, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to show you isn't just another retelling of the Nazi bell myth. I'm going to walk you through the actual documented evidence, the parts that are real, verifiable, and frankly more disturbing than any science fiction story. The legend of Die Glocke has captivated researchers for over 2 decades. But here's what nobody talks about. The story didn't emerge from some dusty wartime archive. It surfaced in the year 2000. Let me repeat that, the year 2000. That's 55 years after the war ended. So tonight, I'm taking you on a different journey. We're not going to speculate about anti-gravity or time machines. Instead, I'm going to show you what actually happened in those mountains, what we can prove, and why the truth might be more complicated and more sinister than the legend. Let me start with something that will surprise you. Every single claim about Die Glocke traces back to one source. His name is Igor Witkowski, a Polish journalist and military historian. In August 1997, not 1945, not 1950, but 1997, Witkowski claims he was shown classified documents by an unnamed Polish intelligence contact. These documents supposedly contained transcripts from the interrogation of SS General Jakob Sporenberg, who had been tried and executed for war crimes after the war. Now here's where it gets interesting. Jakob Sporenberg was very real. He absolutely was an SS Obergruppenführer. He absolutely was tried by a Polish war crimes court. And he absolutely was executed on December 6, 1952 in Warsaw. But here's the problem. The official trial transcripts, the ones that are public and verifiable, contain no mention of any bell-shaped device, no mention of Zerum 525, no mention of anti-gravity experiments. What Sporenberg did testify about was the murder of approximately 62 German scientists and technicians. He admitted to ordering their execution. This part is documented. This part is real. So what was he covering up? That's the real question. Witkowski published his findings in 2000 in a book called Pravda o Wunderwaffe, The Truth About the Wonder Weapon. British aerospace journalist Nick Cook picked up the story in 2001 in his book The Hunt for Zero Point, and suddenly Die Glocke exploded into popular consciousness. But I've gone through every declassified archive I could access. British intelligence files, American military government reports, Soviet capture documents, and you know what I found? Nothing. Not a single wartime document mentions Die Glocke by name. So am I saying the whole thing is made up? Not necessarily, because there's something else in those mountains, something very real, something that cost thousands of lives. If you want to understand what happened in the Al Mountains, you can't start with Die Glocke. You have to start with Project Reese. And Project Reese? That was absolutely real. In September 1943, as Allied bombing raids intensified over German cities, the Nazi leadership made a decision. They would move critical military production underground. The Owl Mountains of Lower Silesia, today's Poland, then Germany, were chosen for their solid rock formations that could withstand bombing. What they built there was staggering in scale. The project consisted of 7 underground complexes: Rzeczka, Włodarz, Osowka, Sokolec, Sobon, Jugovic, and extensive work beneath Książę Castle. These weren't small bunkers. We're talking about tunnel systems extending hundreds of meters into solid rock, with halls 10-12 meters high and volumes of 6,000 cubic meters. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, documented the costs in his post-war memoirs. 150 million Reichsmarks. To put that in perspective, Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters cost 36 million. The construction consumed 328,000 cubic yards of reinforced concrete, 277,000 cubic yards of underground passages, 36 miles of roads, and 62 miles of pipes. Here's what makes my skin crawl. To build this complex, the Nazis established a network of 13 forced labor camps called Arbeitslager Riese, all administered as satellite camps of the Gross-Rosen concentration camp. At least 13,000 prisoners worked on Project Riese. Most were Jews transferred from Auschwitz, about 70% from Hungary, The rest from Poland, Greece, Romania, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Typhus, starvation, exhaustion, cave-ins, executions. And here's something that haunts me. To this day, the mass graves of these workers have never been found. When the Soviets captured the region in May 1945, they found the complexes extensively damaged. The Germans had systematically destroyed evidence, collapsed tunnels, burned documents. Only 11% of the tunnel systems were reinforced by concrete. The project was never finished. But finished or not, what was it for? The official explanation, the one Speer gave at Nuremberg, was that it was intended as Hitler's headquarters. But there's a problem with that theory. Comparing Ries to similar facilities, like the Mittelwerk factory that produced V-2 rockets, suggests a different purpose. The tunnel layouts at several Ries sites match underground factory designs. The hall dimensions, the ventilation systems, the layout, it all points to industrial production, not headquarters. And there's evidence they were planning to manufacture something specific. In 2014, researchers uncovered documents suggesting Messerschmitt Me-262 jet engine production was being relocated there. The Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, and its engines were complicated, precision instruments, so yes, there was secret weapons development in those mountains, just not what the legend claims. I need to pause here for a second. If you're finding this fascinating, do me a favor and drop a comment below telling me what you think really happened in those tunnels. And if you haven't already, smash that like button, because what I'm about to tell you next about Hans Kammler is going to blow your mind. Every story about Die Glocke eventually mentions one name, SS General Hans Kammler. And unlike the bell itself, Kammler was very, very real. Hans Friedrich Karl Franz Kammler was born in 1901 in Stettin. He held a doctorate in civil engineering and joined the SS in 1933. By 1942, he was overseeing the construction of concentration camps, including the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Let me be absolutely clear about who this man was. Kammler's signature appears on work orders for the gas chambers. He personally decided to convert underground morgues into killing facilities and add freight elevators to transport bodies to the crematoria. The Holocaust would not have reached its industrial scale without Hans Kammler's engineering expertise. But by 1943, his role was expanding. He was put in charge of constructing underground factories for the V-2 rocket program. At Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, 20,000 prisoners died producing these rockets under Kammler's supervision. Half of them died just during the manufacturing process. By March 1945, Kammler had become one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Hitler appointed him Führer's General Plenipotentiary for jet aircraft. He controlled Germany's most advanced weapons programs. He reported directly to Hitler and Himmler. And then in early May 1945, Hans Kammler vanished. Now the official story goes like this. On May 9, 1945, Kammler ordered his driver to pull off the road near Prague and shot himself. His body was allegedly buried in a shallow grave by his entourage, and that was that. In September 1949, a German court officially declared him dead. But here's where it gets weird. In 2014, German historians Frank Durbert and Rainer Kalsch published declassified documents that tell a very different story. They found a report dated August 1949 by special investigator Oskar Packe, who worked for the US military government in Germany. Packe's conclusion was explosive. The suicide of the subject, suspected and allegedly confirmed by the witnesses, is refuted by the CIC's precise information about his capture and escape in May 1945. The CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps, had captured Kammler. According to these documents, he was captured on May 9, 1945, the same day he supposedly killed himself. There's more. Major Morrison, head of the CIC branch in Gmunden, Austria, stated he had interviewed someone about a numbered bank account related to former SS aircraft and missile production sites. Only 3 people had access to this account. The implication is clear. One of them was Kammler, and here's something that should have raised massive red flags. Despite being one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals, the UN listed him among the 13 most wanted. Kammler's name disappeared from wanted lists almost immediately after the war. At the Nuremberg trials, where dozens of Nazi officials were prosecuted, Kammler's name appears exactly once and only in an indirect reference. This is a man who oversaw the Holocaust's infrastructure, commanded the V2 program, and controlled Nazi Germany's secret weapons. One mention. Now, was he part of Operation Paperclip, the program that brought 2,500 German scientists to America? Most historians say no. Kammler wasn't a scientist, he was a civil engineer and administrator. His knowledge was second-hand. He knew where things were, who worked on them, and how to organize them, but he didn't have the technical expertise that made someone like Werner von Braun valuable. But researcher Dean Reuter, author of The Hidden Nazi, makes a compelling case. Von Braun and the other rocket scientists needed to get to American lines before the Soviets captured them. They needed someone with authority who knew where all the equipment, documents, and personnel were hidden. That someone was Kammler. Reuter's research suggests a deal was made. Kammler delivered the entire rocket team, the locations of hidden supplies and documents, in exchange for what? A new identity, immunity. We don't know. What we do know is that every single one of the German rocket scientists brought to America under Operation Paperclip benefited from Kammler's disappearance. They could blame all the atrocities, the slave labor, the 20,000 deaths at Dora, the war crimes, on the vanished SS general. They presented themselves as apolitical engineers just following orders. It was convenient, too convenient. So if Die Glocke probably didn't exist, what were they actually doing in those mountains? Let me show you what we can prove. First, the henge. This circular concrete structure near the Wenceslas mine is real. You can visit it today. It's approximately 30 feet in diameter, heavily reinforced, and shows evidence of exposure to extreme heat. The concrete has a greenish discoloration. The ground around it remains bare of vegetation even 80 years later. Parts of the structure look partially vitrified, melted by intense heat. Die Glocke believers point to this as proof of exotic energy experiments. But here's the thing. German demolition teams used thermite charges and explosives to destroy sensitive facilities. Thermite burns at 2,500 degrees Celsius, more than hot enough to vitrify concrete and sterilize soil. Similar structures exist at other German industrial sites from the same era. The design is consistent with cooling towers for underground machinery or ventilation systems for subterranean facilities. Second, the testimony about executed scientists. This part is documented. Sporenberg admitted to executing 62 people, but the question is, what were they working on that required their elimination? If it was just a factory producing conventional weapons, why kill everyone? The Americans and Soviets captured thousands of German weapons scientists after the war. Most weren't executed to maintain secrecy, unless what they were working on wasn't the product. Maybe what they were working on was the process. There's evidence that experiments were being conducted on prisoners. Not exotic physics experiments, medical experiments, radiation exposure studies, chemical weapons tests, the kind of research that would put you on trial at Nuremberg. Third, the substance called Serum 525. No such compound has ever been identified. But here's what we do know. The Germans were experimenting with mercury compounds for various purposes. Mercury was used in some weapons development. It's highly toxic and can cause the kind of symptoms attributed to Die Glocke experiments. Could Serum 525 have been code for a classified mercury-based weapon or industrial process? Possibly, but there's no evidence it was anything more exotic than that. So why does the legend of Die Glocke persist when there's so little evidence? I think it's because the truth is simultaneously more mundane and more horrifying than the fiction. The reality is this. In those mountains, thousands of innocent people, mostly Jewish prisoners from Auschwitz, were worked to death building something. We know it was massive. We know it was expensive. We know it was so secret that the Nazis murdered everyone involved rather than let the project fall into Allied hands. But we don't know exactly what it was. And that unknown, that gap in the historical record, is what allows legends to flourish. The Die Glocke story fills that void with science fiction. Anti-gravity, time travel, Nazi super science, it's exotic, it's thrilling. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, there are still incredible secrets buried in those mountains. But I think the real story is darker and more human. I think Project Reese was exactly what it looked like. A desperate attempt by a dying regime to move weapons production underground. I think they were producing jet engines, possibly working on rocket components, Maybe conducting weapons tests that required secrecy, not because they broke the laws of physics, but because they broke the laws of humanity. And I think Hans Kammler cut a deal. I think he traded everything he knew, locations, personnel, technical data, to avoid the hangman's noose. And I think American intelligence took that deal because getting von Braun and his team was more valuable than justice for a single SS general. The mass graves still haven't been found. The full extent of what happened in those tunnels remains classified or destroyed, and that's the real mystery. Die Glocke probably never existed, but Project Reese absolutely did. And what happened there? The deaths, the experiments, the cover-up, that's the story that deserves to be told. If you want to help me continue investigating stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Kammler made it to America? Do you think there's still evidence buried in those mountains? And most importantly, why do we prefer to believe in Nazi superweapons rather than confront the documented atrocities they actually committed? That's the question that keeps me up at night. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.